morning, everyone. Welcome to sunny Atlanta for what has now officially become the largest biomedical engineering society meeting ever. We're expecting, I think that's something to applaud for, absolutely. We're expecting almost 4,000 attendees. And if you want to applaud again, we had in 2008 we had 2,000 attendees. So we've doubled the meeting in basically 4.5, 5 years. So to start off things this morning, I'm going to introduce for the last time and in one of his last official activities, Bmes President Dr. Rick Waugh, who will give the State of the Society address. Rick?
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta to the Biomedical Engineering Society annual meeting. I just want to take about 15 or 20 minutes before I introduce the plenary lecture to give you an update on where we are as a society. First, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors. In addition to setting a record attendance, we also set a record for sponsorship for this meeting due to the hard work of the people in the central office and the generosity of our sponsors, who you can see on the screen. Thank you all very much. I'd also like to thank our hosts, Georgia Tech Emory. And I should point out, not only are they providing hospitality and feet on the ground in terms of getting the meeting organized, but they also make a substantial financial commitment to the meeting, and one that's equivalent to a platinum level sponsorship, which is considerable. And so, like their predecessors, Brown, University of Connecticut, and the UT Austin, we owe them a great deal of thanks, not only for their hard work on the ground, but also for their financial support. So thanks, Georgia Tech and Emory. I also want to recognize our outgoing officers and board members. Rich Hart has served the last 2 years as secretary to the organization. Rich, thanks very much. We have outgoing board members Paul Citron, from Medtronic, Shelley Sakayama Elbert from Washington University, Jane Grant Allen from Rice, David Vorp from the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you all for your last 3 years of service on the board. The nominating committee was headed by George Trusky. It was a superb slate of candidates and the ones who have been elected to new positions. David Vorp has moved up from the board to the executive committee, and he'll take Rich's place as secretary of the organization. And our new board members are Kristen Billier, Jane Grant Allen, signing on for another 3 years, Ravi Bellamkonda, and Scott Diamond. During the course of the year, what keeps the society going in terms of day-to-day activities is the BMES Executive Committee, which consists of the president, either the president-elect or the past president, the treasurer, the finance committee chair, and the people listed on the board here. So moving forward, Gilda Barabino will be taking over tonight as the president. Jennifer West is the current treasurer. Dan Hammer is the current chair of the finance committee. And of course, Ed Schilling is the executive director. Rich Hart, as I mentioned, is leaving. And also Laurie Seton is rotating off as chair of the publications board. And replacing them will be David Vorp in the secretary position, and Frank Yin, who will be the new chair of the publications board. So these are the people who are responsible for the day-to-day leadership of the society. I should say actually month to month, because we only talk about once a month. The people that are really responsible for the day-to-day activities are shown on this slide, and that's Ed Schilling, the executive director, and the outstanding staff that he has put together at the national office. Regina Borkowski is head of student affairs, chapter development. Terry Young is the director of the BMES Career Connections, and I'll talk a lot more about her role in just a minute. Jennifer Edwards is our new membership director, coming up with a lot of new initiatives in terms of membership and maintaining and enhancing the membership. You'll see the fruits of her labors in just a minute. Michelle Cericchio is taking a new position as the education director for the society, and I'll be talking about her role as well in a minute. Doug Beiser is our communications director, and all of the new presence you're seeing on the web, on Facebook, on Twitter, and the wonderful videos of the meeting that are going up live, those are his doing, and we really owe a great deal of thanks to him for bringing us to the digital age in terms of getting our message out to the world. Valerie Kohlmeister is the person responsible for keeping the wheels turning in the central office. Debbie Tucker is a consultant, and she's the one who really puts the meeting together, and the fruits of her labor have been evident in the high quality of the meetings we've enjoyed for the last 4 years. And we also have administrative assistants, Sue Graviador and Clarice Williams. The awards committee is responsible for selecting the recipients of the awards that we'll be giving during the meeting. The Robert Pritzker Award is what we'll hear about in just a moment from Ajit Yoganathan. The Reader Schaefer Award recipient is Christian Metallo, and he'll be talking on Saturday morning, bright and early. The BMES Diversity Award goes to Monty Reichert from Duke University. He's also up for a talk on Saturday morning. And tomorrow we'll be hearing from the NIH NIVIB lecturer, Sangeeta Bhatia from MIT. The Distinguished Service Award will be presented tonight to George Trusky. It's very important that we get good nominees for all of these awards that we're presenting to recognize outstanding contributions to biomedical engineering and to the society. So think about your colleagues, think about people that you admire and respect and look up to, and think about putting their name in for one or two of these awards. You can find out the procedures for submitting nominations on the BMES website. I encourage you to do so. The Fellows Committee has the job of selecting new fellows every year, and there are 8. Ravi Bellamkonda from Georgia Tech, Dal Irvine from MIT, Kostas Konstantopoulos from Johns Hopkins University, James Leary from Purdue, Phil LeDuc from Carnegie Mellon, Doug Knoll from Michigan, Ann Satterback from Rice, and Melody Schwartz from École Polytechnique in Switzerland. The National Meetings Committee is headed by David Vorp. They have a huge responsibility in terms of organizing the meetings and making sure everything is done on time and appropriately. The next meeting that BMES is sponsoring is the January 2nd to 5th meeting by the Cell and Molecular Bioengineering Special Interest Group, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. It's going to be in Waimea, Hawaii. This is a Gordon-style meeting. The requests for abstracts have gone out. Check our website for more details. Next year, the meeting is early. We're not in October. We're at the end of September, 25th to 28th. We'll be in Seattle, Washington. Bill Wagner is the meeting chair, and Gordana Bunyak-Novakovic is the program chair. We've also selected new meeting sites for years ahead. In 2014, we'll be in San Antonio, Texas. John White's the meeting chair, and Susan Margulies is the program chair. In 2015, we'll be in Tampa, and in 2016, we'll be in Minneapolis. So I mentioned that Jennifer Edwards has done an outstanding job with membership, and you can see that on this chart. We've essentially, not only have we doubled the size of the meeting in the last number of years, but we've also doubled the size of our membership. And that's a very promising trend, and we look forward to continued growth. We've also increased the number of student chapters. Last year, we had 73 qualified student chapters. This year, we have 86. Including our very first student chapter from a historically black college or university. So congratulations to North Carolina A&T for that distinction. With all of the growth, you might imagine that financially we're actually in very good shape. The income for 2011 totaled $1.85 million. As you can see, most of the income comes from the meeting revenue and from dues, with additional revenue from investments, gifts, and other sources. The income exceeds expenses, which were $1.78 million last year, most of it being spent on personnel and operations as is appropriate, because what the dues are for is to provide member services, and these are the people that deliver those. We're working on developing a financial reserve, or a reserve fund for the society. Currently, we have these funds parked with Bernstein Global Wealth Management. We originally invested just over $1 million in 2008, and we've been adding to that fund in the years since then. Our long-term goal is to obtain an investment reserve capital that would be 2 to 3 times our annual operating expenses, which is considered fiscally prudent for nonprofit organizations. As of September 2012, the stated balance is $2.1 million. But some of those are restricted funds. So we have $300,000 that's reserved for the Pritzker Award, $220,000 for the Rita Schaefer Fund, and $368,000 which was obtained from a new Coulter grant. So those funds are allocated to provide interest revenue to fund those, the monetary awards that go with those honors. I'll talk about the Coulter Grant more in just a moment. So I want to just take a couple minutes and talk about the progress we've made in the last year. If you remember last year in Hartford, I presented the strategic plan that we had come up with. It was an actionable strategic plan, and we've actually been taking actions, and I want to bring you up to date on some of our progress. We've had some significant developments. With regard to Goal 1 and Objective 1, which was to enhance cross-professional interactions, we, with the help of the Coulter Foundation, have acquired the BME Career Alliance. Now, this is an organization that was run by Charlotte Triplett, supported by the Coulter Foundation, that organizes local meetings to bring student chapters and local industry together for professional development, career training, and networking. It has now become the BMES Career Connection, and you'll be able to access information about it through our website. Terry Young, our staff member, is the director of this now and in charge of organizing these regional meetings, and she'll be working closely with Don Peterson of the Industry Committee to coordinate with developing industry chapters in relation to these meetings. A second objective under Goal 1 was to promote translation through BMES, and in support of this, we've gained a significant grant from the Coulter Foundation to support, first of all, the Coulter College, which some of you had the honor of participating in yesterday. I understand, at least from the students I've talked to, that it went extremely well. And so we'll be looking at the outcome of that and hopefully continuing that as a part of the BMES meetings in the future. At this point, we're still evaluating how well it went yesterday. They've also provided support for a special symposium on translation and the translation track, and provided funds to hire our new educational director, Michelle Cericchio, who has played a major role in getting the Coulter College presented yesterday, and will continue to develop other educational instruments, including webinars on our web and professional education programs that will be part of these regional meetings that we're planning. Our second goal included an objective to establish and implement plans to provide meaningful small group interactions and idea exchange. One of the challenges, I think, of having a society that is large as ours is that sometimes you sort of get lost in the numbers. And so what we're trying to do is to develop these special interest groups to provide smaller communities within the society to provide a sense of intimacy and belonging that might not happen in a larger impersonal institution. So we have established our first special interest group. It's the Cell and Molecular Bioengineering group. Their mission is to promote interdisciplinary research, communication, cooperation, and education as they relate to cell and molecular bioengineering. They're organizing this specialty meeting, which will be in Hawaii in January, as I mentioned earlier. And in the future, they will also be participating in developing annual meeting content. So I urge all of you out there to think about who your colleagues are. If you don't feel that cell and molecular bioengineering is your thing, think about what colleagues you can bring together to create more of these special interest groups. I think this is going to become a major organizational theme for the society as we move forward. Goal 3 involved an objective to increase participation of women and underrepresented minorities, and I wanted to point out a special event that we're having at this meeting tomorrow afternoon at 2:45, and that is a symposium on healthcare inequalities. This was organized by our new president, Gilda Barabino, and Jerry Collins, who is chair of the Ethics Committee. And they've attracted a special guest, Mr. Fred Gray, who is a legendary civil rights attorney who represented Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and the men of the Tuskegee study. So if you have a space in your schedule, fit that one in. Coming soon, we're going to be transitioning to a new web platform. This is going to bring, hopefully, a much more user-friendly web interface, particularly in terms of dealing with membership. One thing I also want to do is to get our strategic plan up on the web, not just as a stationary document, but sort of as an interactive way for members to find out not only what we're doing as a society, but to find out ways where you can tie in and participate. So what we'll be listing are the individual objectives and also the committees that are responsible for the activities related to those objectives with contact information if you'd like to participate. And of course, more. Finally, I want to mention that tonight we'll be handing out awards at the awards ceremony, and there will be a town hall following the awards ceremony. Town halls are pretty boring if there are no questions. So during the day today, think about questions and bring them with you to the town hall. The executive committee, the members of the executive committee who can be on hand will be there to try to answer your questions. So with that, it's time to get to the main event of the day. The Pritzker Distinguished Lectureship Award is given each year to recognize an individual for outstanding achievements and leadership in the science and practice of biomedical engineering. The awardee is expected to deliver a plenary lecture at the BMES annual meeting, which is coming shortly, and publish the text of the lecture in the Annals of Biomedical Engineering, our flagship journal. A very important purpose of the lecture is to critically review an area within biomedical engineering and offer a vision for the future. It's my pleasure to introduce this year's Pritzker Distinguished Lecturer, Ajit P. Yoganathan. Professor Yoganathan is a Regents Professor and holds the Wallace H. Coulter Distinguished Faculty Chair in the Wallace H. Coulter Department of Biomedical Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology and Emory University. He is also the Associate Chair for Research in the department and the founder and director of the Center for Innovative Cardiovascular Technologies. He received a bachelor's in chemical engineering from University College in London and his doctorate in chemical engineering in 1978 from Caltech. Since joining the faculty of Georgia Tech in 1979, he's been instrumental in founding the joint department with Emory. His 40-year research career has been pioneering and translational in nature, applying basic engineering science to develop meaningful human health outcomes, particularly in the realm of cardiovascular engineering. He takes an interdisciplinary and translational approach to his research, as you will hear, and has established collaborations with clinicians, scientists, and industry professionals worldwide. Using state-of-the-art fluid dynamic measurement techniques, Dr. Yoganathan and his group have developed methods enabling the optimization of replacement heart valve designs. He's also developed novel techniques in the assessment of native heart valve function, and those have provided clinicians with improved tools to assess disease severity and help identify effective treatment options. His work also encompasses investigations of the structure and function of the left and right sides of the heart, evaluation of congenital heart disease, and the development of minimally invasive cardiovascular interventions. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed journal articles and 40 book chapters in leading journals and books, and he has mentored some 48 doctoral students, 35 master's students, and 30 postdoctoral trainees. In 2009, he co-founded Apica Cardiovascular with his invention of an innovative transapical access and closure system that is designed to simplify and standardize the technique used to open and close the apex of a beating heart. In the same year, another one of his inventions related to mitral valve repair was licensed to a major cardiovascular medical device company. Dr. Yoganathan's career has been distinguished by a number of high honors. In 1985, he was awarded a Humboldt Fellowship from West Germany to spend 9 months at the Helmholtz Institute for Biomedical Engineering at the Technical University of Aachen. He received the Edwin Walker Prize from the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in the United Kingdom in 1988. In 1992, he was elected a founding fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering, and that same year, he also spent 6 months at the University of Aarhus in Denmark as a visiting professor of the Danish Research Academy. He received the H.R. Lissner Award for his contributions to the field of bioengineering in 1997 from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. In 2005, he was awarded the Theo Pilkington Award for his contributions to biomedical engineering education by ASEE. He is the founding editor and current editor-in-chief of Cardiovascular Engineering and Technology, the newest journal of the Biomedical Engineering Society. He also currently chairs the International Standards Organization Subcommittee on Cardiovascular Implants. He is a fellow and former member of the Executive Committee of BMES. He has served as a member of the NIH Surgery and Bioengineering Studies section and is a former chair of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Bioengineering Division. He collaborates with and advises professionals within the cardiovascular device medical industry, working with companies such as Medtronic, St. Jude Medical, Edwards Life Sciences, and Boston Scientific. On behalf of the Biomedical Engineering Society, it's my distinct pleasure to present the 2012 BME Pritzker Distinguished Lecturer Award to Ajit P. Yoganathan. Ajit.
Rick, thank you very much for that introduction. Colleagues, students, guests, it is truly an honor for me to stand up here today to receive this award. When I started my graduate school in 1973, the field of biomedical engineering really didn't exist as it does today. Since starting there and getting into this field, I found it to be a tremendous area for excitement, enjoyment, and prosperity in terms of intellectual knowledge and the ability to contribute towards human healthcare. And as you will see in this talk, which I will try to weave a story, which is from bench to bedside, a journey through translational research, which sort of shows how my career has evolved in certain aspects. I hope to be able to show you the impact that biomedical engineering has had on human healthcare and the tremendous potential it holds for the future. Especially to the younger generation of young graduate students and undergraduates, you are coming into a field that is blossoming. As Ed mentioned, 5 years ago we had 2,000 people. Today we have 4,000 people at this meeting. I remember attending the first BMES meeting at Virginia Polytechnic, which was held in classrooms there, and I think there were maybe 200 people, 250 attendees. So the whole field plus this society has come a long way. I want to start out with this slide, which most of my graduate students, past and present and postdocs, have seen. But it just shows that when I came in 1973 to Caltech, I had no idea about the field of biomedical engineering. I had come thinking that I would work in the field of air pollution and environmental chemical engineering, when one of the faculty got up and started talking about using and understanding blood flow through arterial vessels and understanding the sound that is created when a physician puts that cuff on your arm and tries to measure your blood pressure, crot cuff sound. The idea was, could we understand something about the fluid mechanics? And that's how I got in this field. And as this slide shows, sometimes one needs to explore avenues that suddenly show up that you're not expecting and to take advantage of that. And as you will see in the topics that I talk about, most of them have come due to interactions with clinicians and the medical field. However, I think we must take pride and enjoyment in what we do, and I must say that I have really enjoyed every bit of this career that I've had in this field, and I see great opportunities as I look in this room and see all the young faces. If you look at what the definition of translational research is it's driven primarily by the practical use of research results. Now, this could apply to anything, any field, but in the field of biomedical engineering, it is really solving a clinical problem or looking at an unmet clinical need. And the best people that can provide us with that information are colleagues in the medical school or the doctors and clinicians we interact with. So clearly, as engineers, we should look and interact closely with our medical colleagues so that we can understand what clinical problems or unmet needs they face on a day-to-day basis. And then translating that research from the laboratory, whether it be in academia or in industry, from bench to the bedside, or as I say, the bassinet, as you will see, working with young children or babies. Clearly, there is much need in the area of pediatric cardiovascular medicine, as well as other areas of pediatrics. These research results generally include intellectual property and potentially could lead to commercialization. However, I think the main goal should be not the commercialization to make money as a faculty member, but to have the satisfaction of being able to see your research translated in the clinic towards helping human health. So really, if you look at this circle shown here, we start with the patient. The clinician tries to figure out some issues that they deal with. These are at a variety of levels. It's on a multi-scale level, going all the way from molecules and cells to devices. And that's where the role of the engineer comes in. The engineer translates those understandings in interaction with the clinician, uses that to come up with a device, a therapeutic, a tool, whatever that might be. And then we go into some kind of testing. We show here an animal model. It may not be animal model. It could be some tests that are done at a biological level, so to show the safety of what you're doing, and then finally to the patient. So we go a full circle from the patient and back to the patient. And I think that is the tremendous opportunities we face today, the ability to contribute as knowledge, biological knowledge increases. I want to give you examples of outcomes of translational research. One is in the area of diagnostics, where you are diagnosing, and I'm shown two tools here that have revolutionized things in the cardiovascular area: cardiac ultrasound and magnetic resonance imaging. These came about due to engineering technologies that came up with two diagnostic methods so we could look at structure and function of the heart and the cardiovascular system. Another area is the creation or design of devices. So the areas I'm talking about are areas that we work in at Georgia Tech, and I have worked throughout my career. We have on the left prosthetic heart valves, devices that have been used in patients to save millions of patients since 1960. So the pacemaker and the prosthetic heart valve are probably the longest lasting medical devices that have been out there. Today we have cardiac stents that are used to take care of coronary artery disease instead of open heart surgery. We have annuloplasty rings for valve repair. And on the very right-hand side is shown an extracorporeal assist device that is used for keeping children on continuous dialysis therapy from 1 day to up to 2 to 3 weeks. So these are just an examples of devices that come out of translational research. The other area that is beginning to take hold is the area of surgical and interventional planning. In other words, providing the clinician with tools to understand the anatomy and physiology before they intervene, whether surgically or minimally invasively. Shown on the very left is an image of an MRI of a child with a single ventricle. We have replacement devices that are on catheters that can be threaded through arteries towards the heart, and minimally invasive repair devices on the very right-hand side that are being used today to repair native heart valves. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in my research career is the impact of going outside of my own doorstep and that is going globally. And that is not only in terms of the students that have worked with me and postdoctoral fellows, but the tremendous number of colleagues in foreign countries that we've had the opportunity to interact with, both in engineering as well as on the clinical side. And in the United States, we've had collaborations across the country with a number of medical centers in terms of cardiovascular research. So I'm going to start out with the area of heart valve disease, an area that I started out my career at Georgia Tech, at Caltech, working with, very fortunately, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Earl Harrison, who ran the heart valve clinic at USC LA County Medical Center, one of the largest hospitals in the country. And Dr. Harrison, at that time in 1974, was a leader in the area of heart valve disease and understanding of prosthetic heart valves. So I had the good fortune of running into him at Caltech, and it was with him and my former advisor, Bill Cochran, that we embarked in this area of heart valves. Very quickly, we look at two different aspects of heart valves. Heart valve, when it does not function, either on the left side or the right side, either becomes stenotic, in other words, provides obstruction to blood flow, or valve becomes incompetent and leaks blood flow, and therefore loses its efficiency. There are a variety of reasons that we get heart valve disease listed here, and I'm not going to spend time going through all of those, but suffice it to say today the two major causes of valve disease are the aging and calcification of the aortic valve and degenerative tissue diseases and ischemic heart disease that affect the mitral valve. So let's start off with the aortic valve. And right up front, I would say that all I'm doing is giving you an overview of certain areas where we've had an impact in our research. I'm not going to cover everything, so if there are former students or postdoctoral fellows in the audience, if I don't touch on your work, please don't feel offended. We try to cover the area as what we thought was more the translational aspects. So shown here is a normal and a bicuspid aortic valve. The normal aortic valve has 3 leaflets, but approximately 1 to 2% of people are born with a bicuspid valve. And as you can see at the bottom is shown a normal trileaflet aortic valve and a bileaflet aortic valve that they've calcified, and shown there is the narrowing of the area within the flow, therefore leading to much higher resistance to blood flow, and therefore a larger ventricular load. We looked at this, and shown here on the bench are created models of a normal aortic valve and varying degrees of stenosis. And what is characteristic there is you can see the jet in the middle indicating higher velocities through there. The heart will try and maintain its cardiac output to a level that even a valve that goes from an area of about 5 square centimeters down to 1 square centimeter would still allow the same amount of volumetric flow of blood through the heart. So you can then just understand that the velocities would increase approximately from anywhere in a normal valve from 1 meter per second up to 6 meters per second in a severely stenotic valve. This is shown here in some of our quantitative measurements using laser Doppler velocimetry in terms of understanding the flow patterns, the velocities and shear stresses created going through a stenotic aortic valve. The interest in this area in the mid-'80s began in terms of trying to understand the fluid mechanics of these bench studies to translate that to the newly emerging area of Doppler ultrasound. The ability to measure velocities non-invasively with ultrasound in a human in the aortic valve, and how could they translate that information to the pressure drop across the valve, which is what the clinician normally is interested in because he or she wants to know what is the effect of the stenosis. The velocity itself does not give them a good indication of the load on the ventricles. So the ability to do this made us, we looked at using the conservation of energy principle, using the Bernoulli equation, and essentially came up with this formula down there that allows us to either measure the peak gradient or the mean gradient during the pumping time across the valve by measuring just the downstream velocity downstream of the valve. I will not go through the mathematics that evolved, but this was essentially what is called the Bernoulli analysis for measuring Doppler. Now, this technique is used today, day in, day out. It is the routine method of analyzing the resistance across aortic valve. Prior to that, they had to insert catheters in you to measure pressure, which clearly carried a risk and was invasive and took at least 2 hours to do, 2 to 3 hours, while this Doppler examination can be done in 30 minutes. After developing the methodology, the principle of using this, we also assessed it on the bench using laser Doppler velocimetry and online pressure measurements, which is shown here and was published in Circulation in 1986. So the translational aspect of this work was taking what we as engineers would consider a fairly simple fluid mechanic concept, but giving it very broad application today in clinical cardiology. If one cannot say if your normal valve is at the level of more than 50% of its efficiency, it has to be replaced. And as this slide here shows, we've had heart valves since the late 1950s. However, there are a number of undesirable characteristics that happen, the main complication being blood clot formation, damage to blood cells, and thromboembolism. These are related to flow features such as stasis, separation, elevated shear stresses. And the question is, can we use engineering, bench studies, and computational tools to mitigate some of these problems? Shown here are some of the problems that we've had with prosthetic heart valves. We have characteristic problems with the durability, which is structural failure, as well as the bottom valve shows, these blood clots forming on the valve, essentially then making the valve malfunctional, and also if those clots break off and travel to your brain, they could lead to a stroke. This was sort of the state things were in the mid-1970s, where people really didn't have to do anything to come out with a prosthetic heart valve. Essentially, one could design a valve in your garage, do some minimal testing, and implant it in the human. In 1976, Congress passed the Devices Act, where it gave authority to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to regulate medical devices. Since that time, all medical devices have to show that they are safe and they are efficacious. In terms of understanding the thrombosis and thromboembolism problem, here's essentially a concept from the 1900s, 19th century, discussed by Waugh, where you have Waugh's triad, where essentially you have blood flow, the biomaterial surface, in this case the prosthetic heart valve surface, and the blood coagulation of the patient, all playing a role in terms of creating or mitigating thrombosis and thromboembolism. So flow is a critical factor in the area with these devices in either leading to or mitigating the formation of blood clots and microemboli. In 1976, a pathologist at NIH, cardiac pathologist, wrote an article, a review article, and at that time showed his intuition for looking at blood flow, or what he perceived would be flow across these different heart valve types that existed. At that time, it was the ball and cage, a flat disc, a tilting disc, and a porcine valve made out of the pig's aortic valve tissue, And what he proposed was that the flow patterns these valves created were very different from what's shown in the middle, the native valve. And therefore, those uncharacteristic or flow patterns would lead to blood damage of some sort, and therefore, one had to understand the flow patterns if one was going to improve valve design and mitigate thromboembolism. We have, in our hands today, multiple tools for looking at flow through heart valves or other devices. We can look at qualitative techniques such as flow visualization, laser Doppler velocimetry, either in 2D and 3D, particle image velocimetry, again in 2D, 3D. And then on the clinical side, we have color Doppler imaging, that's the Doppler ultrasound. We have magnetic resonance imaging. And these tools can also be used on bench models. They don't have to be restricted only to the patient or to animals. Today, in the last decade, we've seen a significant enhancement of computational fluid dynamics as applied to the cardiovascular system. It is an area of tremendous research growth and opportunities. And we're also looking with understanding the biological system, looking at coming up with novel ways of doing benchtop blood studies. And the reason these tools are important are clearly on the bench. We can do experiments under controlled conditions and also minimize the need for animal studies and also minimize the need for long, lengthy clinical trials. I'm going to talk about two mechanical heart valves types. One was the tilt one. The first one shown here is, I'm going to talk about the tilting disc valve, which was very popular in the late, from the mid-60s until about the late 80s. And the bileaflet valve design, that is like a butterfly, that has been around since 1978 and today is the most commonly used mechanical valve design. Here's some of the issues that we face with these valves. Approximately anywhere from 1 to 5% of these valves in patients have create thromboembolic complication. That's a significant number. And all these patients have to be on lifetime anticoagulation therapy, which is a real challenge. And if they are not on the anticoagulation therapy, as shown in this one slide, this one patient stopped taking his or her anticoagulation therapy for approximately 2 months, and this was the result of it. The valve completely clotted off, and the patient died. The valve was removed and stuck in an open position. And that is what you see here with this tilting disc valve. With the bileaflet valves, we see these clots form in these pocket areas, the micro hinge areas. One can use color Doppler to understand the flow patterns in an animal model or patient. This shows in a sheep model where we did this up at NIH, showing the flow patterns across this tilting disc valve, as shown here. And you can see here this area, this blue area, is an area of very low reverse velocity. So that is underneath that disc, essentially a potential area for stagnation and blood clot formation. And you can see as the cardiac cycle grows, that area becomes fairly big. Here's a real-time video of that, and you can see as the blood flow goes through there, you can see flow coming from the left atrium into the left ventricle, and if you can see this area underneath the disc generally has very low velocities. In the mid-1970s, the Bjork-Shiley valve, which was the most commonly used tilting disc valve at that time, had problems with blood clot formation on the underside of the disc. We did some work during my graduate work at Caltech using laser Doppler velocimetry to do these velocity measurements. This was the first time anyone had tried to do quantitative measurements of blood flow across a tilting disc, any type of prosthetic valve. As you can see here, we have higher velocities coming over the disc versus underneath. And if you look at a plane even closer, you can see this huge area of stagnation adjacent to the underside of the disc. Now, one would say as the disc opens and closes, some of that would get washed out. Depending on the blood coagulability of the patient, the anticoagulation regime, you might be able to control that, but if not, you could see here two examples of, in this particular case, minor deposition of thrombus here, and in this particular case, a large thrombus. Again, it is patient-specific because of the blood coagulation properties as well as the medication the patient's taking to mitigate platelet aggregation and clot formation. As I said, the bileaflet mechanical heart valve today is the most commonly used design today. Approximately 90% of the mechanical heart valve market is dominated by bileaflet design. There are about 5 different designs of these valves made across the world by different manufacturers. And mechanical valves are about 45 to 50% use in approximately 350,000 patients a year, the balance being biological bioprostheses. So what is unique about these bileaflet valves is what we call the hinge mechanism. This area here where blood goes through that allows those leaflets, hinges to open and close. And here are shown 3 different designs of bileaflet hinge. The St. Jude Medical, the Carbomedics, and on the very right-hand side shown the Medtronic parallel. Well, what we're looking at here are flow characteristics across both in the bulk flow as well as through the hinge mechanism. Now, this hinge is made out of optically clear material, rapid prototyped or rapid prototype machine, where we can look, and here are hydrogen bubbles flowing through that. So we are looking at both large-scale and small-scale features, essentially pointing out to the nature of the multi-scale nature of the problem. And essentially, you can see we are looking at extremely complex flow fields, both in the bulk as well as in the hinge area. So we're looking at a multi-scale problem, whether we are looking at it experimentally or computationally. If you're using computational tools, you'd have to use a large-scale solver, and at the micro level, or essentially in those gaps that are between 100 and 500 microns, you're looking at a scale smaller, what we would call microscale CFD. If you look at the bulk flow, this is what you see. And what I really want to point out here again is just the parameters you can measure. Here's the flow visualization qualitatively. This is particle velocimetry, where you can look at 2 and 3D flow fields. And here is the vorticity pattern, which shows the complexity of the flow. This shows comparison between experiment and computational fluid dynamics. In our laboratory, we do both experimental and computational work. And this is showing some work where we validated our CFD solver that we have been using for a number of years. With experimental work, this is work that we're doing in collaboration with Professor Soteropoulos, who's now at the University of Minnesota. Let's now look inside the microscale hinge flows, because as we saw, the clots were forming in that hinge area, which is really the Achilles heel of the bileaflet design. So let's look at the Medtronic parallel valve. This was a valve that was designed in the early 1990s, went into clinical trials in Europe around about 1995. All the macro studies that had been done, the animal studies, showed the valve should perform well. Unfortunately, what was seen in about 13 out of the first 60 patients who received this valve in the mitral position was clot formation in that inflow hinge. The trial was immediately stopped, and there was a tremendous effort to understand what was going on. As part of that effort, we were able to create, together with Medtronic, create clear housing models of the hinge, exact replicas, and using micro LDV, or somewhere between micro and macro laser Doppler velocimetry, for the first time look and see what flow was going inside these hinges. As you can see here, during the forward flow through this hinge in the mitral position, there's very little flow. It's actually just circulating. And if you look during the phase that the valve is closed in the mitral position, one would expect, due to the high pressure gradient, that there would be significant washout of this inflow hinge. Unfortunately, that did not take place. This hinge was poorly designed in terms of getting that inflow pocket and essentially areas of stagnation and separation was seen. And that was really the cause of the blood clots in the 13 patients, the first 13 out of 60 that were implanted. The valve never came onto the market after that. And since then, there has been a much better understanding of trying to understand in the newer bileaflet designs and even the St. Jude valve, which has been out since the late 1970s, to understand what is going on. Now, this is a laser Doppler velocimetry across the hinge of a St. Jude bileaflet valve. And here you can see that the valve, the hinge area is getting washed out nicely. Now, was this designed with that thing in mind? No, actually, this valve was designed in the early 1970s. Prior to, we had these technologies for assessing. But today we have the tools for looking at these types of flow fields and getting a better understanding, and then seeing whether these devices should go into the marketplace, should they go into a clinical trial. This is a slide summarizing a variety of hinge designs that we looked at. And today we can even expound this using computational fluid dynamics. And this is work that we did in the late 2000s, and looking at really flow through the hinge at different levels with CFD, and then here looking at particle release times through the hinge. The advantage of the CFD is if you have a solver that works and validates, it allows you to look at the entire field and look at things that are very hard to do experimentally. Those LDV studies that I showed you would take at least 2 to 3 weeks to do, point-by-point measurements, extremely tedious. And in certain areas, we couldn't measure because of the optical access. So again, computational tools, if validated, have tremendous potential in device design. And today, they are being implemented and used in conjunction in a pragmatic fashion with experimental measurement techniques. We also now can do studies at the level of the platelet or blood cell. This is ongoing work in our lab together with Professor Cyrus Aden in mechanical engineering, where we're using the lattice Boltzmann method for looking at seeded particles there. Those yellow little dots are platelets, and we want to look at the trajectory of platelets through this hinge over a cardiac cycle and to plot out the stress history, shear stress history of a platelet, because it is not only the magnitude of the shear stress, but it's the duration of time that the platelet is exposed to certain levels of shear before they would get activated. Let's move on now to the bioprosthetic valves. And these are valves that, together with other valves, with mechanical valves, are used in the area of replacing. These are made either out of the aortic valve of the pig or the pericardium tissue from a calf. Very quickly, I'll just show you studies that we have done really to get to the next level of where these valves are going today. This is looking at flow visualization to qualitatively look across these two types of bioprosthetic valves. This slide shows you quantitative measurements of particle image velocimetry across a valve at two different cardiac outputs. It allows us to measure the flow field, look at areas of high shear stress, different, and vorticity, also look at areas of stagnation. But where is the field going today? Today, these valves have to be implanted using open heart surgery, be on a bypass, blood bypass machine, and essentially have your chest cut open. Technology has begun to revolutionize things, and today, this is where we are. It is the state-of-the-art, what are called transcatheter valve technology. These are tissue valves, 3 leaflets, as you can see. These are for the aortic position, mounted on metallic or material, shape memory alloy material, or stainless steel, on a stent, with the idea that you can stick this valve, scrunch it down, and put it into this little tube, a catheter, which could be anywhere from 8 millimeters to 14 millimeters in size. So now you have taken a device that's 25 millimeters to 30 millimeters, crunched it down, put it in a delivery system, which now allows you to access the heart without cutting open the chest, either through your femoral artery or through a puncture through the apex of the heart. Here are 2 valves that are being used in the United States today, the Edward Sapien valve that received FDA approval last year, and the Medtronic Core valve that is being used in clinical trials today. The question, now, as I showed you, there's about 5 or 8 other designs out there that are in various stages in Europe. The question is, these valves are now being deployed without the clinician being able to open the chest, having the touch and sensing feeling or direct visual. These are done under image-guided therapies. However, the questioning is, can you position the valve properly? And if you don't, how do you move it? There are a lot of questions out there. Clearly, these are valves of the future. What we are interested in is to understand what improvements are there in the fluid flow characteristics of these devices in terms of, again, trying to understand these before they are implemented in a clinical trial. And again, here we can show 2 different valves. Here's one with a big, long stent here, the way it's designed, and one in here that's hard to see, but it's a much smaller stent. And again, what we're looking at here is qualitatively looking at the flow fields. And then we can look at the different ways of positioning the valve, because again, the clinician has only a limited ability to deploy this valve in a given position, and therefore we want to see, are there areas of concern if the valve is not positioned properly and if it's deployed incorrectly or not in the optimal fashion. These are ongoing studies. This is the cutting edge of heart valve therapy today. Now let's move on to talking about the mitral valve, another area that we have worked in for a number of years. And really looking here is a very early description of the mitral valve, drawings from Leonardo da Vinci. This is what the valve looks like. This is a cutaway of a pig heart, and you can see the mitral valve is extremely complex structure. It has 2 leaflets, it has these papillary muscles that are attached to the left ventricle wall, and the chordae tendineae that emanate. So it's a complete apparatus. It's just not a valve by itself. And up here is what we call the annulus of the valve, which is this coming in from the left atrium into the left ventricle. The function of the mitral valve is to allow blood flow to come in from the atrium into the ventricle with minimal resistance, and during systole to close off with no blood regurgitating. However, there are a variety of pathologies that affect the mitral valve. The 2 most common are functional mitral regurgitation, that is an ischemia of the ventricular wall that causes the mitral valve to deform due to ventricular deformation of the remodeling of the ventricle, and degenerative valve disease that affects the leaflets that alter the function of the valve. So mitral regurgitation is essentially blood that's flowing backwards, and is there a way, and this echo Doppler, color Doppler image from a patient shows that. And today we have the tools. This is done intraoperatively. This is done with a transesophageal probe. This is, and you can see how much leakage there is. So when this technology evolved in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, there was clinically people tried to measure jet area or the size of the jet to give them an idea or to quantify the amount of blood flow leaking backwards. Unfortunately, if you look from a fluid mechanics point of view, that really doesn't translate into the volume of blood flow leaking. And there was a lot of misinformation that was out in the clinical literature. We approached the problem in the early 90s, and this is work of Ted Kipp, where we took fundamental engineering principles, fluid mechanics, using the conservation of jet momentum in a jet, to come up with a way of quantifying regurgitation. And this was by enabling us to measure quantities that we could do by Doppler ultrasound, and then utilizing that to quantify the regurgitant flow. So what we needed was the velocity at the vena contracta of the jet, right in the highest velocity, and the velocity somewhere downstream in the jet at a given location X. And with those two parameters, one could quantify blood flow that was leaking through the central orifice in sort of an unconfined jet. And this was clearly one way of doing this. Unfortunately, most jets that emanate from a mitral valve are not these nice central jets that come out. The leaflets are there, the left atrial walls are there, and blood flow, the flow tends to hug these or impinge on them, and therefore you really don't have a nice free jet. And essentially, we came up with some correction factors to handle this, but really it wasn't a satisfactory way of measuring in the clinic the regurgitant blood flow. So we approached the problem from the other side, the upstream side of the leaking valve. And if you have a hole in a plate, again, ideal fluid mechanics here, you would have flow that comes in and converges through this hemispheric surface. And essentially, if you could measure the radius of that distance from the hole of that hemispheric surface, you knew the velocity, because that was something that by color Doppler you could know where that surface was and what the velocity was. One could then, use this formula here to calculate. You had the radius, you had the velocity, and you could calculate the volumetric flow through that. Again, this was an idealized condition. In the heart, we don't have circular holes. And this is not in an unconfined chamber. Again, with this PISA technique, as it was called, we came up with correction factors using both experimental and computational methods, and came up with what is called a hemispheric and hemielliptical formula. The technique is today used in the clinic. It is the only tool that the cardiologist has for quantifying regurgitant flow through the mitral valve or the aortic valve. And these measurements were done in 2D, and as you would know that the flow there is 3D. Today, with 3D ultrasound, I think we have a better opportunity of quantifying this regurgitant volume better using a hemispheric or hemielliptic volume to look at flow, and that's ongoing work in our laboratory currently. However, what else could we learn about the mitral valve other than just quantify mitral regurgitation? Yes, that's one way of quantifying things. How about trying to understand what is going on? So as shown here, anywhere from 1.6 to 2.8 million people suffer from ischemic mitral regurgitation. It originates from this geometric remodeling of the heart and essentially pulling the valve apart, creating mitral regurgitation. And the question is, we need to understand this if we are going to figure out what ways of fixing it. And really, the problem approach is what we want is to create engineering models to isolate these factors to improve clinical knowledge. They are better than large animal models. There are animal models out there, but the animal models are limited in their capability and very expensive. So the approach we have taken is really on the bench, using sophisticated instrumentation and measuring tools to look at a variety of things, look at the effective geometry and hemodynamics on valve function, trying to understand the mechanism by which the valve closes or valve leaks, and determine the way for repairing the mitral valve, which is what is clinically done today, using an annuloplasty ring at the level of the annulus of the valve, and then to compare these metrics that are very hard to do in the clinic or in animal models. This is a flow simulator shown in schematic form that allows us to control a variety of physiologic conditions, and where we can mount a mitral valve and look at a variety of things. This is a snapshot of what we can do. This shows a porcine. We can either put porcine or human mitral valves in the loop, and what shows here is what we can measure. You can see in this valve is leaking, it doesn't close properly. We can look at ways of repairing the valve and assessing that on the bench. These are sort of the measurement modalities that we can utilize. 3D echocardiography, and this is on the bench using a clinical machine. This is work we've done together with Michael Sachs, who's now at the University of Texas. Leaflet strain work, looking at the mechanics of the valve. We can look at placing small transducers on the cords to measuring chordal forces, again, to understand what is going on at a fundamental level, the mechanics of the valve, and we can use different segmentation tools for looking at different areas of the valve. Additionally, we can look at flow through the valve using particle image velocimetry. We can put the valve structure into a micro CT and get very nice detailed measurements of the structure, because this would be useful in any kind of computational modeling, whether it be fluid mechanics or structural mechanics. You really need a very nice understanding of the structure. And then we can also look at strains at the point where the cords insert into the leaflet. So what have we learned? Some highlights of some of the work we've learned from this. One of the things we found is it's the positioning and displacement of the papillary muscles have a tremendous impact on the function of the valve in ischemic mitral regurgitation. It's just not the annulus, but it's the entire remodeling of the ventricle that affect it. And if you do not correct the position of the papillary muscles, putting in an annuloplasty ring and correcting for that alone will not solve the problem long term. And clinical data that's been out now for the last decade show that anywhere from 30 to 45% of these patients have recurrent mitral regurgitation within 5 years after surgery. And that's a huge number of people out there. So the significance is really to understand here the positioning of the papillary muscles within the ventricle and to get an understanding what would happen as you reposition the papillary muscles and the structure of the valve. The annulus in the mitral valve is saddle-shaped. It is not flat. And the original dogma was it was saddle-shaped, so it would essentially minimize regurgitation. So the question was, is that the case? Our studies showed that was not the case. The reason for having the saddle shape was more on the mechanics of the valve. It distributed the forces on the cords more evenly, so it was more nature's way of balancing the forces on the cords, as well as optimizing the strain on the leaflet. So here's clearly the way that nature intended, and we can see that a saddle-shaped annulus optimizes how the strain is distributed. And today, because of some of this work that has come out of our laboratory and other labs, now manufacturers are looking at different saddle-shaped rings instead of this flat planar ring. So this essentially, what else can we do with this? And this is more recent work that we have started doing. It is actually a good test bed for looking at different mitral valve repair techniques. Surgeons use different ways of repairing the mitral valve. They use patches to augment the leaflet. They cut away parts of the leaflet. And there are various surgical techniques that are used that are published in the literature. And working with our surgical colleagues, both here in Atlanta and other centers, we've been able to look at different techniques and understand what that functionality does. What does it do not only to minimizing, restoring proper function, but also to the durability of the repair? So the other area, in addition to that, is what are the forces that act on this valve in a real system? And in collaboration with Joe and Rob Gorman at the University of Pennsylvania, we've been looking at the forces on the annulus in an ischemic model of mitral regurgitation, really to understand if people are trying, and there's a lot of efforts now, people are trying to model the mitral valve, trying to understand what are the boundary conditions you would put into this. And we have designed force transducer that can be implanted and left in for anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks in the animal, and to be able to measure the forces that occur, in this case showing the septal-lateral and transverse forces, really to get an understanding what goes on in a normal versus ischemic heart. Another area that we have looked at in understanding is mitral valve mechanics is the ability, there is now tools out there where with minimally invasive with this device here to come in with a puncture through the heart and place a clip across the mitral leaflets. The question is, what kind of force does that create and what's the durability? And in some recent work that we have been doing, where we have been looking at clipping the valve on the bench, we've been able to understand the force measurements and also to see if these forces are too much that such a repair would fail over a period of time. So what is the future role of engineering in mitral valve diagnostic and function? And this area is just fascinating that here's what's happening today. Can we make these treatments more patient-specific? Because clearly mitral valve disease has a spectrum and one size does not fit all. And I just show you some examples of devices that are being coming out on the marketplace, or at least being investigated as potential tools for mitral valve repair and correction. I want to talk to you about two things that where we have contributed from the cardiovascular fluid mechanics lab. And this is a device that we licensed a few years ago for adjusting not only the annulus, but also the papillary muscles. It was called Geo Control because we were trying to control not only essentially the geometry of the valve in toto. And this came out of the PhD work of Dr. Jorge Jimenez, that we came up with the idea for this design, tested it in animals, and then licensed it. The current way of accessing the human heart is through a sternotomy. The question is, can we come into the heart some other way? And this is a device that, together with the original idea coming from a surgeon at Emory, Dr. Tom Vasiliadis, for looking at apical access into the heart, a device that over a period of about 3 years, we went through different modifications, and this is actually an ongoing study clinically today in Europe, where we've done 15 patients for accessing the apex with a catheter and leaving essentially and plugging up a small hole, essentially to do this with minimal blood loss. And this is what apical cardiovascular is. And this is the way a lot of things are going to happen now in future heart surgery, is to be able to access the heart with small incisions, clearly revolutionizing where cardiovascular medicine and surgery and intervention is going. And I end up here with one final slide in this area showing what is going on. This is a slide courtesy of Siemens, where they're combining different modalities of imaging, MRI, ultrasound, CT, and trying to do this in real time to provide the clinician with abilities of doing and understanding different interventional things and coming up with ways of intervening more effectively. And this is where we think technology is going to This is the current approach. Look at the ultrasound and go in. We think you're going to take that information, do some analysis, and then be able to render that analysis and provide online information to the clinician. Online meaning not necessarily in real time, but take this data, process it, and in a couple of days to a week provide significant information to the clinician in terms of either both structure and function to understand, and in this case we're looking at repair of a mitral valve. And to end up with, I would like to spend the next few minutes talking about another area that we worked in for the last decade, and that is using the pediatric area, correcting single ventricle defects. These are children that are born with only one side of their heart or one functional left ventricle. Approximately 2,000 to 3,000 children are born in the United States with this. It requires a palliated approach of 3 stages of surgery, the final stage being this Fontaine, Fontaine surgery that essentially creates bypassing the right heart because you have only a single ventricle and that's going to act as your left ventricle. So you're bypassing the right heart now to get blood flow back to the lungs, and you have essentially what is shown here schematically, a cross-type connection. That is what it looks like in very simple engineering terms. That's what we started out with glass models that we created, but this is what the true geometry looks like. These are 5 different patients. This is from 3D MRI reconstructed. And you can see the cross configuration, but very bizarre geometries. Today with MRI, we can get anatomic and flow boundary conditions. That allows us to do 4D CFD. This is showing a CFD simulation through one of these geometries. The boundary conditions are actually time-varying flow that we can get from MRI. Now, what is the interest in doing something like this? It's really to look at the energetics of the connection and to see how blood flow is distributed. Essentially, these children who get this surgery have had 3 surgeries by the age of 3, may have a lifetime of maybe into their teens and maybe into their mid-20s. After that, this connection fails, and essentially either they have to be transplanted or else they die. So the question is, can we make this surgery more efficient and longer lasting? And that is where we come in with this virtual surgery tool that we have developed together with Professor Rosiniak. Actually, it's his tool from our College of Computing that really gives the surgeon the ability to look at now this last stage of the surgery to connect this part of the vessel back in here. And this shows the rest of the anatomy that the surgeon has to work with. So this is allowing the surgeon to pre-plan his surgery before going into the operating room. MRI or CT information is provided, and essentially the surgeon works on a tool such as this, and he can come in and what we call the baffle, try different anatomic configurations. That can be provided to us that we can do CFD simulations. If we take this to a very specific case, shown here is an example of a child who had a failing Fontaine. And what was happening here was, as you can see, the flow coming from the inferior vena cava was getting shunted mainly to the right lung. And therefore, the left lung was being starved of nutrients coming from the liver, and therefore creating malformations in the left lung. So the idea was, how could we correct this really complex flow pattern by altering the geometry? We took this information, the boundary conditions from the pre-surgical MRI, and we saw that the CFD matched what we were seeing with the PC MRI. We could see qualitatively they matched, and we could get quantitative information from the CFD to see this, what we call the hepatic flow distribution, flow that was coming from the liver, how much of it was going. 94% of it was going to the left, right pulmonary artery rather than the left. And that is one thing that we could not get out of the MRI measurements. These were the 3 options the surgeon wanted to try. He thought essentially by bringing the flows together and creating a collision, he could cause mixing, which was intuitively correct. We did the simulations on the 3 options, and as you can see, his first option was no better than what existed. The second option was good, and the third option was even better in the sense that it forced more blood into the left lung. This one was energetically more efficient somewhat compared to this. We provided this information to the surgeon, and in a blinded fashion, the surgeon chose to use this. And the rationale the surgeon used was, if I can force more blood into the left lung, those malformations in the lung would get better, and then the flow would balance out over a period of time. This was done in 2008, and even today, this child is doing well with 94% oxygen saturation. Prior to surgery, the oxygen saturation was 60%. And finally, we've also patented a technique for creating this junction from the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava to the left and right pulmonary artery. This is the OptiFlow connection. And here's an example of that where we've taken the bottom half of that connection, and essentially a surgeon here has created a Y graft. This has been used here in Atlanta by Dr. Cantor, the main pediatric cardiac surgeon here in Atlanta. And we have 2 publications that just came out this year where we've looked. He's done 15 patients to date, and I just want to show you what it looks like. This is an MRI cine image, flow image of one of those children looking at flow through this Y graft connection. If you look at that in just looking at the baffle itself, this is what the MRI shows. It's the MRI flow. However, this was based on predictions we gave the surgeon as how to place the Y graft, what angulation, and what size. And this shows an example of that. This is the virtual prediction that was done prior to the surgery. This is the postoperative result. And you can see, based on postoperative boundary conditions, and you can see there's a good match. Obviously, will this happen every time? Probably not. But this is, again, at least in pediatric cardiac surgery, the wave of the future, trying to plan the surgery so you can optimize certain things that the surgeon has control over. In order to do that, we are actually starting a multi-center randomized trial, hopefully funded by NIH, with 3 of the major pediatric centers on the East Coast: Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Boston Children's Hospital, where we have 5 surgeons participating in this study. So to end, I would like to talk about the challenges that are inherent in translational research. So I've shown you where we've used diagnostic, using engineering principles for providing clinical information, device modification, device analysis, and actually even coming up with devices. And then in this final case, using this to provide information for surgical or interventional planning. I think one has to keep an open mind when you're doing translational research. You have to work with very unpredictable timelines. It is different when you're working in translational research and in terms of getting things out. And you also have to have the right mix of people, not only in your lab, but in the clinicians you work with, because at the end of the day, it's the team that is really contributing towards this work. It is just not me, it's the graduate students, the postdocs, the clinical fellows, the cardiologists, the cardiac surgeons we work with. So to end with, like I said, I've had a tremendous ride in this area. It has been a lot of fun with a lot more to come. Clearly, this can't be done. Clearly, if you look at this, we're dealing with multi-scale problems, multi-physics problems. Clearly, the scales and the physics make the challenges tremendous for engineers. And we have multimodality solutions. We have devices, diagnostics, therapeutics, as well as minimally invasive techniques. But these are all areas in which everyone sitting in this room can contribute to. And as I said, this is not an individual effort. I'd like to thank my family here who have try to keep me on the straight and narrow in terms of the hours and days that I spend on this work, but the rewards are tremendous. But again, I thank them for all their support and love. And finally, none of this could be achieved without this multitude of people shown in a collage that was done a couple of years ago to the students and postdocs, a number of whom are here sitting in the room, who have contributed to this work, as well as the funding we have received over the years. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks for a very inspirational talk. We have time for one or two questions. There are microphones in the aisles. If anyone has a question for Dr. Yoganathan. We have a question here.
Thank you very much for this really inspiring talk.
Sorry?
Thank you very much for this really inspiring talk. It definitely made me want to learn much more about valves and cardiac engineering. So I just have a quick question with regards to the aortic valve. So I guess the contractile force that the myocard generates varies quite a bit across population, especially in diseased patients with ischemic myocard or after myocardial infarction. So I'm guessing my question is, how does this variability, whether this variability has an important impact on the design of your device, since I guess I understand that the valve would flip open under certain pressure threshold, and whether you would need to individualize your design for particular patients.
Well, I think you bring up a very good question. These are things that today we are able to at least start thinking about, looking at what are the forces that these valves that are implanted face. And really, yes, I mean, in certain cases, if the annulus is very heavily calcified, you're going to get one type of loading condition versus an annulus that is damaged by another type of disease. But clearly, if you're going to do, as I said, one size doesn't fit all, and really we have to look at things that are patient or population specific when you're looking at these kinds of treatments in the future.
One more question?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit, for a wonderful, fascinating survey of our field. Quick question regarding transcatheter valve. We have now some clinical evidence that tissue valves may get damaged during the crimping and the delivery. Would you think that maybe polymer valve would offer a better solution? And also related to that, inherently, once we employ such a valve, we still always have the problem of collar stenosis once the valve is deployed over the diseased valve. If you could briefly refer to that.
Well, like I said, this is technology that's really evolving today. It's in its infancy. Clearly, polymeric valves have a tremendous potential. Again, the question is their durability and the formulation of the correct polymeric material. There are a lot of other things that one has to consider in doing this, because now essentially you've taken away the touch feeling sensation that the surgeon has, and also the direct optical access. So as imaging gets better, maybe we can minimize some of the complications that occur. It really is going to evolve into getting better imaging tools. And when you talk to companies like Siemens or Philips, there's a lot of research that is going on in their back rooms to come up with better imaging for online interventional therapies.